I like that, though, for the audience that he's speaking to, right? You might try to wonder how these things are different in the same time, right? How is that contradiction resolved? Well, in the same way that you resolve the Trinity every Sunday, you fucking freak!
That's a good point. That's a good way to put it. Hello.
Hey.
Welcome to Left Unread.
Welcome to Left Unread.
My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're just two members of a socialized cleaning force moving from neighborhood to neighborhood with drastic efficiency.
Lovely. And this go-round, we are returning to Capital, Volume 1.
A critique of political economy by the one, the only...
Dr. Karl Marx.
Dr. Karl Marx. That's exactly right. Just want to take a moment to do a quick bit of self-crit. On the first Capital episode, I said that Paul North was from The Ohio State University. That was incorrect. It's actually Paul Ryder. So,
let's go Bucks. I don't really give a shit. Yeah. But anyway, back to Capital.
This time around, we read chapters 3 through 6. And how did it go for you, Aaron?
Chapters 4 through 6 were fine. Chapter 3 was a fucking slog.
Yeah, well, some good news is that I've heard from the one and only David Harvey. I don't know why I'm holding up the book like you can hear it.
Whose companion you are reading alongside.
Makes it pretty clear that chapter 3 is kind of the top of the hill in terms of difficulty. The rest of the argument is much easier to understand. Unfortunately, that's something I'm realizing is that we are probably going to stop at the end of Volume 1, but Marx certainly doesn't.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much more in Volumes 2 and 3, even if the third volume is, like, compiled posthumously. I don't know why I brought that up, but the point is, Chapter 3 was definitely a big bitch to get through, but Chapters 4 and 5 and 6 were quite nice.
Yeah, I found them infinitely more compelling as a reader and clearer. And I was talking back to the text a lot more in those chapters.
Yeah.
I think because I understood more. I understood more better. I understood a little bit more what was going on. Chapter 3 felt like very both redundant and also just impenetrable to me.
There was really a point in chapter 3 where I was like, okay, even if I can follow and accept Marx's argument, you know, forget analysis. If I can just understand and accept Marx's argument, that's great. But now what? In what way am I applying this analysis, you know? When I got to chapter 4, I really felt... I mean, I texted you. I said he really starts cooking. Chapters 1 through 3, he was simply prepping the ingredients, you know? And that's kind of how it is that he's setting up things that may be used later on. And may be used in Volumes 2 and 3 more than Volume 1, I've heard.
Well, what's interesting, and shout out to Dissident Theory, I've been watching his chapter recap videos after I finish our reading for an episode, just to kind of bring it all back into my mind. And he says that something that kind of put it in perspective that he said was chapters 1 through 3 focus on commerce in a pre-capitalist era. And it's in the middle of chapter 3 and onward where he starts to actually shift into talking about the capitalist or post-capitalist mode of production.
Yeah.
And that definitely does change the candor that Marx uses. Yeah.
David Harvey says something similar where he's asking if Marx is making a historical argument or a logical one, and he kind of takes both ways of looking at it at different points throughout the chapters. And it's at that point in chapters, I guess, 4 or 5, you know, that's the first time where we even see capital in the form of capital, not just in the form of like money or exchange value or something along those lines. So there's very specific criteria that creates capital or I guess makes something capital. It's not that it's created, but rather maybe realized, perhaps.
Valorized is the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Maybe not realized, maybe valorized.
Right. Yeah, it's that valorization process that creates capital, which I'm sure we'll get to. So, yeah, I think that is a great point, is that in chapters 1 through 3, we're setting the stage in the way that maybe even history set the stage for then the development of capital.
Yeah.
We're following a developmental argument about the fact that we need to use commodities to fulfill our wants, and to do that, we exchange commodities, and then contradictions within that exchange process are now leading to a different form of circulation. I don't want to get ahead of myself. And then that leads to capital.
Yeah, and this is not a foreign concept to anyone that has ever read philosophy before, because you set the stage by laying the groundwork for historically where the argument has come from, and then you build upon that with your own argument. Side note, I was on Instagram some dude was in the comments of some random Marxist post that I was looking at, and it was like, Marx wasn't a philosopher. And everyone was coming at him so fucking hard because it's such a stupid thing to say. And I think his argument was that he was trying to say that Marx is more than a philosopher. He wasn't just an economist. He wasn't just a philosopher.
Yeah.
But he was coming about it in the most, my shit doesn't stink, I'm smarter than everyone kind of way. And it's so fucking stupid. I was like, he's literally got a doctorate in philosophy. Well, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I've seen stuff on the other side of that equation as well, where it's like, Marxism is truly the science that bridges all other sciences, and I'm like, let's take a step back here, okay? We're focused on one thing right now, and it's maybe the overthrow of capitalism. Let's worry about that. So, Chapter 3.
Yeah, money or commodity circulation. From my understanding, and you can help me develop or correct this, Chapter 3 is basically just talking about the two different forms of commodity circulation, how there's CMC or there's MCM, how and why they are both around and how and why they are different.
Yeah.
And how that means you need some form of money commodity, you need some form of commodity to take the place of money in order to handle those forms of commodity exchange, commodity circulation.
Yeah, it's Chapter 3 sucked, okay? I know that's like going to be a really prevalent feeling here, but it's extending off of where money comes from in its argument in the first two chapters. Money is this universal equivalent. It's a societally accepted equivalent for all other commodities, and in the process of commodity circulation, Marx is saying that it just acts as a means for that transaction to occur, to go from commodity into money and then from money into commodity. And in effect, he even shortens that equation to just be C to C, right? Commodity to commodity. Because in essence, what's happening is that one party is trading the use value of a commodity that they don't need for a commodity that they do from another party. So money in that sense is just a means of the transaction or a mediator.
Yeah, and he, at the start of the chapter, basically says that money is labor objectified as a symbol. I guess I'll give a quote. This is on 69. Money doesn't make commodities commensurable with one another. It's the other way around. As values, all commodities are objectified human labor. Thus, in and for themselves, commodities are commensurable, and their values can be measured communally in terms of a special commodity. That special commodity being money.
Yes. Yeah, even on the next page, I love the way he says, all one needs to do is to read a price list backwards to find money's magnitude of value expressed through all kinds of commodities, right? Yeah. If you think back to that expanded general form that Marx was talking about, where you could take an equivalence in commodity and just swap in whatever commodity you want, right? I have 20 pounds of grain, whatever. I need X, Y, or Z. That is variable. You can switch that out. And I think what's interesting about this argument is the fact that Marx mentions this in the first few chapters as well, but the way that modern economists talk about money and talk about the economy, they start with money. Money is the starting goal. And Marx is really taking the opposite. I mean, literally, in reading the price list backwards, what a modern economist might say is like all of these prices are what are mediating each other through their exchange. That's an argument that Marx directly addresses later on in this section. And he's saying that instead of looking at the money first, it's more important to look at the commodities first, especially because ultimately the money doesn't matter, right? The commodity is the goal. It's to get a commodity to satisfy your want or need.
Yeah, the money is the mediator. What I thought was interesting, and maybe this shows my ignorance or how I haven't still fully grasped the concepts in Chapter 3, he lays out the argument of the forms of commodity circulation as CMC or MCM, meaning commodity, money, commodity, or money, commodity, money, in a linear fashion, going left to right. I don't understand why it needs the three parts. And like you said, he kind of simplifies it down to two, commodity to commodity.
Sure.
But I don't know why it wouldn't just be stacked either way, rather than being, this is hard to describe in a non-visual medium.
Yeah, the teacher in me really desires a whiteboard for some of this.
Yeah, exactly. But rather than it being linear, and it being, say, MCM, reading left to right, why wouldn't it just be C on top of M with a circular kind of mode of circulation? The point is the same.
Yeah.
it doesn't even matter where you start. I guess that's the reason why he makes the distinction.
Well, I think that there's also a third party in both of those means of circulation, right? In C to C, we're thinking about just two people.
Bartering.
Exactly, right? But there is a third person in the CMC circulation chain, right?
Yeah, commodity is sold to get money, and then
you go to a different person and use that money.
Exactly,
so I don't know. Maybe that third person makes it a little more complex. I'm having a hard time visualizing what you mean with the...
Yeah, it's like rather than being M, arrow, C, arrow, M, it would be C on top of M with curvy arrow, curvy arrow. So they're pointing in clockwise directions.
The C's or the M's?
It would be C on top of M.
Well, it's because the second C is a different person.
Yeah,
it's a different person.
I realize that now that you say that, like there needs to be a mediator because you're not probably buying and selling your commodities for money to the same person.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there is still a formulation in which you could diagram it like that, in which a person is selling and then buying a different commodity from the same person. But another thing to mention is that Marx is still working in the abstract for much of this. I mean, there's even points where he's like, obviously, this isn't how it works exactly in the real world, but in our perfect analysis chamber here, we're looking at an ideal form of commodity circulation.
I suppose also opening that door for that mediator is the only space where, like, literally a capitalist can intervene.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I'm not trying to skip ahead too far here, but...
Skip away.
Fucking hell. On 130, even thinking about that mediator, he even says he's putting himself in the position of a capitalist, someone who's buying from A and then selling to C.
From A to B.
Yeah, that's right. I buy a commodity from A and resell it to B, da-da-da-da-da. Even further down there, he says, if I tried to explain to A and B how I profit, they would probably tell me that I'm confused. Because in this scenario, he is literally a middleman. It even ends with that on 131. A and B would declare the whole sequence to be unnecessary. Nothing more than hocus pocus. They'll say from now on, A will sell directly to B.
Yeah.
In that sense, the capitalist is literally just a middleman.
Yeah. And that's where the change in the formulation comes too, because that's where it goes from MCM to MCM prime.
Yeah.
Which is the money plus added value. That's where he's laying the groundwork for surplus value there.
Yeah, exactly. Because while you could think of a circulation in which you go from money to commodity to money, there's no point in doing so.
There's no profit to it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even in the sense that, even in CMC, we're going from commodity to commodity. The ultimate goal is to satisfy the want. But in MCM, we're just going from money to money. And since they're the same money at the end of the day, he says, like, what's the point?
Yeah.
The only reason a capitalist would do that is if within that process, that money becomes valorized, it becomes greater. Mm-hmm. Just like you said, he's setting up for surplus value there.
Yeah, exactly. I guess one thing about Chapter 3, last time when we were reading chapters 1 and 2, I brought up a question about scarcity, and I said that's really probably going to frame a lot of my reading as we move forward.
Yeah.
And there are a few things in chapter 3 that still raise questions for me regarding scarcity. And he maybe addresses it a little without addressing it directly, but it first came up on 71 because he's talking about gold and silver as measures of value. And so this is at the bottom of 71. Gold and silver, for example, act simultaneously as measures of value. All commodities will have two different price expressions, a price in gold and a price in silver. And then he continues on. The value relation between gold and silver stays the same, for instance, 1 to 15. It's, 1 pound of gold for 15 pounds of silver or whatever it is. And the question still remains for me there. Like, so why is silver 15 times less valuable than gold? How do we arrive at this value relation? It still, to me, has to come down to scarcity.
Yeah, there's something he mentions where he says that the two kind of replace each other, right? Where the value of one simply increases to be the other. I even think the footnote at the bottom there, footnote 4, adds a little context to that, right? Yeah, wherever silver and gold exist side by side, the vain attempt has always been made to treat them as one and the same substance. The given labor time is invariably objectified in the same proportion in silver and gold, and one assumes that gold and silver are the same substance, right? So there are, in fact, different labor times in both.
Involved, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that would be Marx's argument as to why they have different ratios is simply because they have different labor times. And I think scarcity is a means of that. He hasn't directly addressed scarcity, and I don't think he's going to.
Yeah.
But like in terms of the socially necessary labor time, if a substance is more scarce, then it will be harder, i.e. more costly to find.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I just keep thinking that, and it's like a variable that I feel like he's not addressing, and maybe it's because he's still working so much in the abstract that he hasn't pinned down on that one tiny little thing.
It feels rolled in, like maybe he'll just like cursorily mention it,
Well, kind of a couple of pages later, he does kind of give some fun trivia that starts to get to it on 74, because he says, as wealth evolved, the more precious metals dislodged the less precious ones from their role as the measure of value. And he says, silver pushed out copper, gold pushed out silver, despite what the poet's chronology says. And then here's the trivia. Pound, for instance, became the money name for an actual pound of silver, and the moment that gold pushed out silver as the measure of value, the same name was attached to, say, 1/15 of a pound of gold, depending on the ratio of the value between gold and silver. So what we think of as a pound of gold isn't literally a pound of gold, because that nomenclature comes from when silver was the standard of value. Well, I think that's fun.
Totally. It kind of soothes my modern day crisis in the fact that we've detached ourselves from the gold standard, because
that's one of my questions, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's because, he's very clear that this kind of direct connection between something that holds value like gold and silver and a price, or even, I'm thinking about the footnote where he says English people have a really hard time discerning between the measure of value and the standard of value, and so I'm trying to be careful about my words here. But it's literally debased. Like, it's easier to detach those things than we might be thinking, So, like, the fact that we have completely detached from this kind of source of value, I think, is possible in Marx's formulation as well.
Yeah.
One more thing, though, just to finish that footnote back on 71.
Oh, sorry.
He even says, I loved this part, the history of the monetary system in England from the reign of Edward III up to the time of George II consists of a continuous series of disturbances caused by conflict between legally established ratio between values of gold and silver. So, like, even outside of this abstract, very mathematical formulation, this kind of like ratio, whatever we're doing here in capital, it's like that contradiction is still apparent in the real world and in real history. Just to give some additional context, that span of time is from 1312 to 1760. So it's not a short amount of time, right? Yeah. They were grappling with the problem of the ratio between silver and gold for 400 years.
Interesting.
Yeah. Right. I love on 75, he starts to talk about the difference between the price and the value, right? He says that commodities require us to lend them our tongues or to hang a tag on them to give them price. But I love on 75, he says a thing's name is completely external to its nature, right? Just because I know a person's name is Jacob doesn't tell me anything about that person.
Yeah.
I just thought that was really funny, because the price itself doesn't actually tell us anything about what it took to make that product, except for a general assumption that a higher price means more value. But that's a quick notion to be dispelled. You see that all the time in the world, right? Like Grey Goose, cheap vodka that they just marked up, and since it's a higher price, people think it's bougier, even though it's the same cheap shit. Any industry that has a value beyond its immediate substance peddles in that kind of thing all the time. Sorry to keep talking about alcohol. It's just, I have a background in advertising, so I've gotten to look at this. Vice marketing is an incredibly interesting history. Ciroc is another great example. The only selling point is that it's made with grapes. There's nothing more valuable about it. There's not really any more labor or anything that goes into it.
Yeah.
But since it has that selling point, people pay more for it. It's just a marketing ploy.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of why it's important for Marx to be working in the abstract at this point, because as I was going through this, I kept thinking if the labor that's objectified in a commodity is worth $10, and then you're going to sell it for $10.
Yeah.
There's no profit to be made there. But the reality is, I know that if there's $10 worth of labor, objectified in a commodity, its sales price is $20 or more. You know what I mean? And that's just because it's an inflated markup. Yeah. I could think of many examples where that was happening. And I kept having to kind of pull back from those thoughts, because I think he's still working in the abstract intentionally to try to set up this formulation.
Well, I think that leads into exactly what Marx talks about on page 77. He says that inherent in the price form is the potential to have quantitative incongruity between a commodity's price and its magnitude of value. So just like you're saying, it's like, I know that there's $10 of value in this thing, but it's listed for 20. What's the deal? And Marx says it's like, that's not a bug. It's a fucking feature.
Yeah.
That ability to have that kind of fluctuation is important. It's part of the whole process. Yeah, he just says it's what allows the price form to be adequate for a mode of production whose laws can assert themselves only as averages blindly operating amid lawlessness. Yeah. Even there's a great quote on page, on 78, under the means of circulation. We saw earlier that the exchange process of commodities implies contradictory and mutually exclusive conditions. As commodities develop, these contradictions don't disappear, but a form arises in which they can move. Real contradictions are generally resolved in this way. It's not that we're resolving the contradiction, it's just that we're creating a form that then has movement. Especially when he's talking about that contradiction between the price and the magnitude of value. It's like, that isn't resolved in any sense that the price matches the magnitude. It's just that the movement of those two objects, the process, is literally what allows us to work through that contradiction in the same way. And I just appreciate that he says real contradictions are generally resolved in this way, because we have and also will certainly spend a lot of time thinking about the contradictions in our society, and to try to think of a resolution as in like a solution might not even be the goal. It's just the fact that we're just looking for a form that we can take or something that allows for a movement. You know what I'm trying to say there?
I guess not. When he uses the word movement, I think... So this was... I was pretty over this chapter at this point, I'm not going to lie. So maybe I was just glazing over it. But when he's talking about movement, I was just kind of reading that to mean like an acquiescence to the process of commodity for money, money for a commodity. It's like, well, the movement is that that formation of circulation continues.
Sure.
Just because, like, I have a use value. I need food.
Yeah.
There's use value in that apple. And it doesn't matter if it's $1 or $10. When I need it, if I have $10, I have to just suck it up and pay the $10 for the apple. And so the cycle of circulation continues, even though this contradiction is still clear that the exchange value of the object is not equal in reality to its use value.
Yeah.
Maybe I was like on a totally different...
I think it's 50-50, because I think I have confused myself a little bit, but even that example that you gave, I think is in line with what I'm saying, right?
Okay.
Because that decision, that movement to say, like, I just have to suck it up and do it, right? That creates a new form, essentially, right? That breaks that contradiction in a way that it doesn't resolve it, but it does allow for the contradiction to exist and still continue.
Yes.
The direct example he gives is that you couldn't say a body is falling towards another body and also falling away for it, right? Those two statements are in contradiction, but the ellipse is a form in which both of those things are happening. So, there is a form which still allows that contradiction to be realized without necessarily being resolved.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're circling the same idea there.
Yeah, I think we are.
Where to go from there?
Well, on the next page, it's when he talks about CMC. Chapter 3, man, it's just a lot of nitty gritty stuff. I really felt the splitting hairs here. It's like so much of this I can understand and put together. Does it really matter? Yes, but like, does it matter in the way that I'm going to apply it? Maybe not.
I kind of felt that way about a lot of what we've read so far, to be frank.
Sure.
I think it's valuable to start to wrap my head around the way these things work. But is it going to change much of the way that I operate politically and economically? Probably not.
The thing is that, like, these very basic, like, ground level arguments aren't for me. They're really for the person I'm arguing with. It's like, if I were to... I would never get into a debate with somebody about capital, for the love of God. But, if I were to try to put forth the labor theory of value in the way that Marx does, and then someone were to argue with me about it and say, like, you idiot, profit comes from exchange, right? Supply and demand, da-da-da. Then I could go back to these and say, like, at the foundational, fundamental level, you are wrong, like that kind of thing. That's what these arguments are for, but they're not for me. They're for somebody else that is arguing with me. Maybe that's not the best way to look at it, but...
that's fair. I guess that's why I'm so hung up on the scarcity thing, though, because that's exactly the argument that I anticipate getting from people.
Yeah.
It's like supply and demand is really just a way of saying scarcity. Why is Action Comics #1 so valuable? Well, it's the first appearance of Superman, so it's got cultural significance, right? But it's really valuable because it's rare.
Yeah.
Because all of those books were pulped in the 40s. To make paper for the war effort.
Oh, God.
And so now, anything that predated that, there are fewer and fewer copies existing. Thus, it's scarce. Thus, it demands a higher value. I don't know why I brought up that example specifically, but it's like I feel like I need to get the scarcity thing resolved because I know that's the first thing that anyone is going to say to me.
Well, I still think we're too early in the book to even address that argument.
I agree.
Again... so sorry to David Harvey, right? But he says that Marx doesn't really deal with circulation all that much until volume 2.
Jesus Christ.
So, if you're worried about scarcity in that sense, then buddy, have I got bad news.
Yeah.
Right? We're going to be talking about production here. Yeah, so I don't know. I think we're still working deeply in the abstract right now.
Yes, agreed. Agreed.
And that's really all I got there. We didn't mention on 77 the fact that Marx says that it's just something important that we kind of glazed over. Things that aren't commodities can be sold for money, right? Conscience, honor, and the like.
I had that labeled as one of my questions. Let's just address it now,
sure.
I guess. Because, that quote really stood out to me on 77. Things that in and for themselves aren't commodities, for example, conscience, honor, and the like, can be sold by their owners for money. A thing can therefore formally have a price, despite having no value.
Sure.
And he continues on the other hand, the imaginary price form can also conceal a real value relation, or a relation derived from one. Witness the price of uncultivated land, which has no value because it doesn't contain any objectified human labor.
Yes.
He's getting at two things there. There at the end, he's kind of getting at the value of potential. The uncultivated land is valuable not because there is already labor put into it,
yes,
but because it has the potential for labor to be put into it and value to be derived from it.
Right.
Okay, but how and why do we value these things that aren't commodities, that have no real value, even though somehow we can sell them?
I think I'm going to start using the word value only to talk about things that contain human labor, because I think that that's what's tripping me up on a lot of this stuff, is that I'm thinking of value as in its ability to reap money, its cost, essentially.
Yeah.
But Marx is using value specifically as a measure of the labor within something.
Okay, maybe price.
Yeah, well, yeah,
value.
Right.
Because he raises that point. A thing can therefore formally have a price despite having no value.
Sure.
How do we arrive at that price? I feel like it's got to be pointing toward a social relation of some sort, but how do I value your honor?
Well, it's
how do I price?
It's part of that incongruity, though. That's the thing. It's part of that contradiction. I, the seller, hang a tag on my honor that says it costs money. Okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's value within it, as in embodied labor. It's just that we can hang prices on things. I think it does come back to a societal relation. I just don't know right now.
Yeah, I mean, because in the modern day, you'll hear people say well, there's a sucker that'll buy,
Sure.
There's someone that'll buy anything out there. You just got to find the person that's willing to do it. And it's okay, so the only thing that gives it value is that social relation. Whatever, I really just fucking love feet, so buying photos of feet or whatever, you know what I mean? It's not inherently valuable. I, as in this hypothetical person.
Okay. Real quick to opt to the feet example there.
Your honor,
I'm sorry.
Right? It has to come down to some form of social relation that I can't quite encapsulate in my understanding of this yet.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I don't necessarily know, but it's something I just wanted to mention because there's a question there, right? I really hope that Marx comes back to that kind of thing later, because that defines much of our society, especially in this day and age. The kind of stuff that we assign price to is not necessarily reflective of the actual value, meaning the labor within it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that will tie in very closely, which again, I don't think we're going to get deep enough in the book today to really dig our teeth into, but there are industries of labor that do not produce commodity, so there must be a value to that labor, but how do we price it when there's no commodity?
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm thinking about a lot of stuff like that. It's hard to
and the thing is, too, is that I think that there's a bit of a trap to think of a commodity as a physical object. Preet commented in our video and said, watch this Paul Cockshot video about Are Baristas Productive?
Yeah.
I did watch it. And Marx uses the example of an opera singer, right? What they're producing, the song, even if it's immediately consumed, isn't a physical thing.
It's effectively a service.
Yeah, but it's still satisfying a want or need, right? In this case, entertainment. So it's not that a commodity necessarily has to be something that's a physical form. It could be. I mean, in that sense, I don't know. Maybe that's abstracting it too far. I don't have the Marxist basis to make that argument.
This is a big part of my questions in chapter 5 and I'm going to try not to get deep into it today, but my hang up with his specific use of the language of human labor, I have problems with that. And I think that clear delineation needs to be made for me to understand the argument in that way.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I think let's keep it rocking. Let's keep it rocking. Literally on page 85, I have my post-it note. When will I stop asking, okay, and... Right? Because I really started to feel that way.
Yeah.
Something, just a quick side note, I do love the way that Marx personifies so much in this book. On page 84, he says that prices are the bedroom eyes at which commodities wink at money. There's some good stuff there. Like, I love when he says non-olet, whatever the source is. You know, it's like the money doesn't stink regardless of its source. The money is abstracted from whatever process reaped it in the first place. Mm-hmm. That was really nice. Kind of to go back, this section here where he's talking about the inversion. I had this thought earlier when we were talking about the formulation of CMC, and we were talking about the actual structure. There's also a matter of the point of view in which you're looking at it, right? The MC in the second half of CMC is actually the same as CM from the perspective of the third person.
Yes.
I don't know how important that really is, but Marx delineates it here, so hey.
Yeah, I felt very much like he was setting something up for later, and I just wasn't understanding why it was necessary at this point. Because he does talk about a kind of two-way representation. On 84, he says, if on one hand money represents a commodity that's been sold, on the other hand, it represents commodities that can be bought.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, are you looking at the first half of the formulation or the second half of the formulation?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he continues on 85. He says, a commodity's two opposing transformations occur through two opposing social processes that are carried out by a commodity owner and reflected in the two opposing economic roles he plays as seller and buyer, essentially. Mm-hmm. Which means that money starts as the end point of one transaction and the start point of another. So it's all just kind of a matter of perspective, I guess.
Yeah, right. He gives a long example about people that are selling linen to then buy a Bible, or then they sell the Bible to buy a booze, you know. Great.
Which is hilarious.
Yeah, very funny. There is a part of me that wonders, you know, I can guess that Marx is doing this to keep a very limited viewpoint, but if you're thinking about those two processes, right? The CMC of linen to money to Bible, and then the CMC of Bible to money to booze, couldn't you connect those two starting points, right? CMC, MC. I mean, to what extent can that be expanded out? I don't know how necessary that is, but it was just a thought on my mind here, is that like these chains are connected, so why doesn't Marx connect them? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I did kind of have a similar thought thinking about how simplified that process is. And I was thinking about cooking, for example. Like, I'm not buying my tofu scramble. I'm buying nutritional yeast, turmeric, etc. You know, I'm buying the block of tofu.
Right.
And then, so it's like, really, I'm buying all of these things. So it expands very quickly from money to commodities.
Right. But
and
also
then to commodity.
You got to be careful, though, because you've just mixed the process of circulation and the process of production.
I suppose so.
Which Marx does keep separate, at least for now.
Yeah.
You know, right? You are buying commodities in part of the circulation process in which you're fulfilling many CMCs.
Yeah, I guess each individual one is just one leg.
Then you're taking a step into the production process where you're taking all of these raw materials, right?
Yeah.
They're actually... I'm, again, getting ahead of myself, but they're losing the commodity-ness of them. They're losing that use value because you're transferring that in your production to the tofu scramble.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Sorry.
Good point. No, that's good. You're right.
Yeah. So
you're exactly right.
It's just that's just something I noticed, is that he is very purposely keeping these spheres separate right now.
Yeah.
You know, I love the way he even talks about it at the end of chapter 3, right? Where he's saying, it's at the end of chapter 4. I think I'll come back to it later, but it's where he says, like, now that we've left the process of circulation, the guy looks around and he sees it as if he has brought his own hide to market and sees only the tannery. You know, it's like we're talking about completely different realms.
Yeah.
You know,
that's fair. Before we leave chapter 3, because this happens in chapter 3.
Sure.
On page 101, you'd already kind of brought up us coming off the gold standard, and that was one of the big questions that I had after this reading.
Yes.
On 101, he's kind of talking around this. He says, paper money represents gold. This law is simply that the amount of paper money issued to symbolically represent gold or silver must be limited to correspond to the amount of gold or silver that would actually be circulating. This minimum amount is made up for constantly changing components, pieces of actual gold, but that does nothing to alter the amount's dimensions or the fact that it flows nonstop in the circulation sphere. Thus, it can be replaced by paper symbols. And so that to me sounded very prescient about the idea of using gold as a standard from which we judge price, I guess I'll say, but then it becomes abstracted almost by itself. So then we can just use a paper symbol for the gold and still use that same kind of value relation. Seems like he's acknowledging how possible it is to use the gold standard and then move off of the gold standard. And I don't know enough about our own history in the United States of the gold standard. When did we go off the gold standard and why? And was Marx right?
Yeah. Serendipitous, because I've just read Nixon Land, and Nixon is the one that got us off the gold standard in the 70s or the late 60s. And he did it basically as a way to debase our own currency. He wanted the dollar to be weaker, and he spun it to the people as saying that your dollar would be stronger and you could buy American manufactured goods and all sorts of shit like that. And that didn't happen, obviously, but I still don't know enough about it to really make a comment on it here. But I appreciated this point from Marx simply because it kind of made me less worried about the fact that we've left the gold standard. Because again, I think that it's, just as Marx saying here, like it is quite possible to move away into a symbol. I don't know. I had that thought a lot. If you could resurrect Marx, what the fuck would he say today? Besides, like, we went to the fucking moon, you know? Like, the moon in the sky? No.
Man weren't meant to fly.
Yeah,
you make him sound like a yokel.
Planes, dude. Yeah. Yeah. So the gold standard is heavy on my mind still. I don't know why. I mean, besides the fact that Nixon was a fucking freak. Fuck Richard Nixon. That's all I'm saying. He was a freak.
But I know it's a common thing in the modern day to look back at Marx and recognize all the prescient predictions he made about how capitalism was going to be moving forward. And this feels like one to me,
certainly.
For sure.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, he does talk a little bit about hoarding money.
Mm-hmm.
Almost as this kind of preliminary to capitalism, like the circulation sphere, I guess, might convince people to start hoarding money instead, right, to take that money out of circulation. But something that Marx makes kind of clear here is that money has to keep being circulated in order for it to kind of retain its wealth.
A certain amount of it anyway.
Yeah, when you take it out, that becomes a problem.
I will say his addressing of hoarding does kind of speak to the scarcity thing that I keep wanting to get answer to. When he's talking about the gospel of renunciation, which I just loved as a phrase. But he says, in order to hold on to gold as money, and thus as part of a store of money, it is necessary to make sure that gold doesn't circulate, doesn't dissolve as a means to purchase an object of enjoyment. And so money amassers forego acting on carnal desires for the sake of their gold fetish. They are serious about the gospel of renunciation. Thus, their cardinal virtues are industry, saving, and stinginess. Mm-hmm. Sell much and buy little. That is the sum of their political economy.
Yeah.
And that's getting to the scarcity thing again, not directly, but they're hoarding all of this stuff and selling stuff so as still to necessitate the use of that they are hoarding, which makes it more scarce and therefore more valuable. I'm afraid of using the word valuable now.
Well, see, okay, that's the thing, is it's just that footnote again where Marx is saying that fucking English speakers in particular have such a hard time with this, you know? I see what you're saying.
Because he even addresses saturation later down the page there. If the amount of money actually circulating is to always correspond to how saturated the circulation sphere is, a country's total quantity of gold or silver must be greater than the amount functioning as coin. Stores of money meet this need.
Yeah. Ultimately, what we're talking about is the desire for the people acting in this sense, MCM, to hoard money because they're trying to extract value, ultimately surplus value.
Yeah.
And that kind of amassment mentality doesn't do anything for them. They're quick to realize that taking their money out of circulation doesn't actually help them in the sense that they want. And so that's kind of when we're moving on into...
This is all the creditor-debtor stuff.
Yeah, I like that he just mentions briefly the fact that merchant capital and interest capital are some of the earliest forms of capital, that they appeared first, and they're also the most disgusting, which I think is very funny. We've made the processes more palatable, or the capitalist has, I guess. Actually, yeah, just to think ahead, when he says that at the end of capitalist production, when capital is finally created, when surplus value is finally realized by the capitalist... He says it's acceptable because no law of circulation has been broken, right? And maybe that's what I'm thinking of here when he's talking about merchant capital and interest capital, is that in some ways they're breaking some kind of law of circulation. I don't actually know how much that stands up, though. He does talk about monetary crisis on page 111.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, insofar as actual payments have to be made, money enters the scene not as the means of circulation, as the disappearing form that mediates a metabolizing process, but rather as the individual incarnation of social labor, the independent existence of exchange value, the absolute commodity. This contradiction takes center stage during those moments of crisis in production in which we call monetary crisis. Such crisis occurs only when the live chain of payments and an artificial system of settling them have achieved an advanced degree of development. And again, to talk about Marx's prescience, right? It's when the flow of money stops that the crisis happens. That is pretty prevalent in history, even in, 2008, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there was money all over the place. A completely ridiculous and artificial system of settling payments had been stacked up, the whole fucking subprime bonds and all that shit. I haven't seen The Big Short in a long time, so I don't really know that much.
We're about to run into this exact same thing again with student loans and the disillusion of
I was going to say, do they still plan on collecting those fucking loans, man?
Department of Ed is the one responsible for it. So if there's no Department of Ed, turn off your auto pay.
Come and take it. That's what I say. If you want these student loan money, you can take it from my cold, dead hands.
Yeah.
It's not my loan, so, no problem. I don't have any student debt. So, yeah, monetary crisis, I just thought that was nice.
Yeah.
Let's get out of chapter 3.
Please, let's...
Yeah, he talks about worldwide money. Who gives a shit? Money takes a certain form when it hits the world stage. I'm not going to try to talk about it.
Shouldn't have taken 60 pages to get everything that he got out of chapter 3.
Yeah, and again, he's still chopping the ingredients, right? He's peeling the carrots to go into this delicious chapter 4 stew.
Yeah, okay, chapter 4.
Chapter 4. The transformation of money into capital. So finally, we're talking about the namesake of this goddamn book.
The eponymous capital.
Yes. Well, he starts the chapter by talking about that thing we were saying, right? The historical conditions under which capital arises kind of started in the 16th century. So finally, when the global market was realized, the world had been encompassed by commodity exchange. That's what set the stage for capital.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so then on 122, he finally talks about MCM.
Yeah.
Money to commodity to money, rather than selling in order to buy, we are buying in order to sell, right? It's transformed into capital. Money is, I should say, money that moves through the circuit is transferred into capital, becomes capital, and in terms of its purpose is already capital. Okay, so he talks a little bit about the MCM formulation. The main thing is just that inversion that we were talking about.
Correct. And then he goes on to talking about the formal differences between the two different circuits, CMC versus MCM. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm just summarizing.
I mean, we are, but that's fine.
Okay. Both circuits can be broken down into the same two opposing phases, CM, a sale, and MC, a purchase. In both phases, the same two thingly elements are positioned opposite each other, a commodity and money, and so are two people wearing the same economic actors' masks, those of a buyer and of a seller. Each circuit is the unity of the same opposing phases, and in both cases, three partners in exchange mediate this unity.
Yep.
So there he does specifically delineate that it requires three partners. Yep. But then he talks about the differences, and really it's just about their inverted order. In the first form, money mediates the total process. In the second, conversely, a commodity is the mediator.
Yeah, we did kind of already elaborate on this when we talked about what's the purpose, right? CMC, the purpose is consumption. I satisfy my wants and needs. MCM, though, what the fuck am I doing? $100 for $100? What's the point? Well, the point is that second $100 actually is a little bit more.
Yeah.
Right? M prime, where M plus delta M, that just means the change in M, right? So the change in the value, that's M prime, equals a sum of money originally advanced plus a supplement. And I call this supplement the amount that exceeds the original value, surplus value.
Exactly.
And that's fucking key.
Yeah.
I think as we continue, we will find that the goal of the capitalist is to extract surplus value. So surplus value really fucking matters here.
Big time. And I definitely felt that. I mean, it probably helps that I knew this already.
Yeah.
But like when he was laying this out, I was like, oh, we're getting to surplus value. Here we go.
Yes, sir.
It does feel like when you're reading that paragraph, like, this is it. This is a sea change moment here.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so as we said, just amassing the money doesn't matter. On page 126, if the 110 pounds were taken out of circulation, it would harden into a store of money. It wouldn't grow by a single farthing, even if it sat around until Judgment Day. So something has to happen, something that valorizes, a valorization of value.
Yes.
Now, something he does mention on 127 is that to become a capitalist is a conscious choice, right? To be a capitalist means that you are consciously bearing this movement. You are actively saying, M to C to M prime.
Yeah, you're seeking that valorization in order to capture that surplus.
Right. It's literally not that you are trying to satisfy a want or need. You're not making boots for the good of mankind, as Marx says in here.
Yeah.
Right. But what you're doing is seeking surplus value. Ugh. It seems kind of grody when you say it like that. Maybe because it is.
Yeah, he says only insofar as the sole motivation driving the capitalist operations is to appropriate more and more abstract wealth.
Yeah. It's just kind of fucked up, man. I don't know. Like, it just really hit me here. It's like, why? Because of some idea that with all of this abstract wealth, you can then buy whatever you want. You could have bought whatever you wanted already. There's clearly a process of circulation which would allow you to satisfy your wants and needs, and it's not the one that starts with money and ends with money. Mm-hmm. So, like, what happened? How did we stop thinking about commodity exchange as a way to satisfy our want and need and start thinking about it as amassing money, hoarding, in order to then, in some distant abstract future, satisfy some want and need that we don't have yet? Where does that come from?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not going to guess. But it's just something on my mind, right? Why?
I would think that that's partially a byproduct of what Marx was talking about in Chapter 3, which is the valorization of money as a commodity in and of itself.
He says that the switch to MCM comes from the contradictions in commodity exchange and money, the money form. Maybe I just missed it, but I'm not exactly sure what they are. What are those contradictions specifically that make people want
money?
Yeah, want money.
Yeah.
You know, for money, is it just because money makes more money, right? Is it because they understand that money can valorize itself, I guess?
Yeah, maybe.
But again, there's still a leap happening where they're saying that this valorized money, this capital, will then do what? What is it about that capital that forces people to make the switch? It's not even a forceful thing because he says that it's a conscious choice, right? To be a capitalist means you're consciously making the effort. So I know we're mixing the abstract and the real here, but, you know, what is it in people's minds that makes them say, I need to create capital? I don't know.
I don't know either. Again, I'm probably oversimplifying it and maybe misconstruing things, but money's use value is to purchase other things with use value. The use value of money in and of itself is pretty pointless. So, like, if you have satisfied all of your needs, there's no use value in money because you no longer need it to purchase the use value of other things. Where does that valorization come to the point where now we're seeking money for the sake of having money?
Yeah.
It's the same question, but I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, just a question on my mind there. I don't know, it just really hit me in the gut right there that the sole motivation is to appropriate more and more abstract wealth. It seems ridiculous. And the way Marx lays it out, I mean, it is ridiculous. Money for money's sake. We're not doing anything. Again, $100 into $100. Why even risk putting your money through that circulatory process? What's the point? Only because it can valorize itself to create more money? You've just created more of the same money. It doesn't do anything in the same way, you know? But it's too much here. Let's keep it rocking. On 128... I love that he says, whereas the money amasser is an insane capitalist, the capitalist is a rational money amasser. When the person who amasses money saves his money by keeping it outside circulation, he's striving after the ceaseless expansion of exchange value. The cleverer capitalist actually achieves that goal by giving his money over to circulation anew. So there's a reason. You can achieve your goal of more money, which again is a stupid goal, by giving your money to this MCM circulatory process, right? And something I wrote on the side is that modern saving isn't geared towards growth. You know, I understand that when you put your money in a savings account, you are still keeping your money in circulation.
Because of the way banks operate.
Yeah, as an extension of the banking system, yes. But just the idea that if you were to ask a rich person, how do I accrue money? How do I make more money? You guys are the experts, you fucking capitalists. How would I do it? They would laugh in your face if you suggested a savings account. And it's because every rich person knows that you spend money to make money. To keep the circulation going is what creates the valorization.
Yeah, savings accounts exist not as a means of making money, but as an insurance against losing money, essentially.
Yeah, and it's also just it's a free loan to the bank, you know?
Yeah.
That my uncle yelled at me. He didn't yell at me. He gave me a smarmy answer because I said I got a tax return, and he was like, you fucking loaned your money to the government for free, you know? And I was like, I don't give a shit. I mean, I do, that they're spending it on bombs and stuff, but in the grand scheme of things, what am I going to do about that? I'm not writing a letter to the IRS saying, I'm only paying 40% of my taxes for these reasons. No.
What does he do? He just underpays his taxes and then pays the government afterward?
I'm sure he pays his taxes completely. And no, I'm sure that I don't know.
There's no way. That's such a
well, it's to perfectly calculate your income and pay exactly the amount that you need. That way you get no refund. You've paid exactly what is legally due. You're not overpaying through some kind of insurance system, that whatever your W-4 says or whatever. It doesn't matter, but again, it's like when you put your money in a savings account, you're doing the same thing. You're giving a very close to interest-free loan to the bank. Yeah. Your return, whatever your savings APR is, that's wrong. That's not the right terminology. I don't give a fuck. I'm not a finance guy, okay? Whatever percent growth that your annual accruement, I stop with the financial terms, Will. Whatever your annual growth is in the bank, that's the interest on your loan to the bank, okay? You've basically given them an incredibly low interest loan because you're looking at that interest and saying, that's my money. You've given that money to the bank. And if the bank wasn't insured and they closed, you would be fucked. You'd lose that money completely. Anyway, a total aside.
I was going to say it is around this point where Marx seems to be dipping his toe into some anti-Semitism, maybe?
I disagree.
Okay.
Because now I've read 3 different explanations of this point, and I can do this. In fact, I sent a picture of this to my group chat, and they were all like, whatever. And then a guy asked me about it, and I explained it, and I could hear them tuning out. Like, I could hear them just gone. Yeah, he does say commodities are circumcised Jews. Interesting. How to tackle that? Well, let's put it in the broader context, right? The capitalist knows that however shabby commodities look, however foul they smell, they are, in their faith and in truth, money, and also a wondrous means for turning money into more money. Okay? The circumcised Jews has a couple of explanations. For one, Marx is from a Jewish family. David Harvey suggests that he might be relating to the anti-Semitism of the time. Right? His family did convert for business reasons, curiously. So that could explain it.
In that, like, he's acknowledging the anti-Semitism around him and saying that, like, this is the way people think of it.
Yeah, let me see what he says here.
Not necessarily embodying it himself, but acknowledging its existence.
Maybe.
Feels a little flimsy.
That sounded
to
nice. Yeah. The explanation I prefer actually just comes from the translator.
Ah, okay.
The line about circumcised Jews refers to Paul's letter to the Romans, 2:25-29, King James Version. I'm not going to read it because it's fucking ridiculous, For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. I don't care. But all he's saying here is that regardless of the outward appearance of the Jew, i.e. he is circumcised in relation to the Christian or whatever, it doesn't matter because in the end of the day, his soul is still saved, right? I'm looking at the line at the end of the footnote. Thus the capitalist resembles Paul, for the capitalist knows that every commodity may be saved by Christ / capital, which cares only about that commodity's soul / value, not its outward adherence to any law / use value. So it doesn't matter that the Jew is circumcised, which might be against the Catholic doctrine or whatever. Again, I don't know. What matters is that ultimately his soul is still saved by Christ, right? It doesn't matter that the commodity's outward appearance is something crazy. It could be foul-smelling, it could be whatever. What matters is that within it is a use value to be realized in the form of money. To use that money to make more money. The outward appearance, right, its circumcision, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all, because what matters is that what is within, right, in the Jew's case, the soul, I hate this, is still to be saved. The value is still to be realized in the commodity, regardless of how it looks on the outside. And I think that is a much more succinct explanation than something else.
Yeah, I'm probably out of my depth, I guess. But
I certainly am. I'm just willing to accept that explanation.
Yeah, that just still feels almost... I know that I bring with me to every conversation a very strong anti-theological attitude. Yeah. And anything that is inherently related to theology, specifically Christian theology, I am quick to be negative toward. And my reading of that quote... The capitalist knows that however shabby commodities look, however foul they smell, they are, in their faith and in truth, money. On the inside, commodities of circumcised Jews. I read that to mean you can circumcise a Jewish person, but they're still a Jew. They're still a dirty, foul-smelling person. That's the reading that I took of it. Yeah. And that's why I was calling it anti-Semitic.
I could definitely see that. I just don't know.
Okay, yeah, maybe.
Well, I mean, Marx is on a religious kick in this section anyway. I love in the next paragraph, now value doesn't simply represent the relation among commodities. It enters into a private relation with itself. so to speak. As an original value, value is different from itself as a surplus value, just as God the Father is different from himself as Son the God, even though they are at the same age and are in fact one person.
Yeah.
I like that, though, for the audience that he's speaking to, right? You might try to wonder how these things are different in the same time, right? How is that contradiction resolved? Well, in the same way that you resolve the Trinity every Sunday, you fucking freak!
That's a good point. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on from that.
Yeah. I'm glad we brought it up, though, because it gave me a chance to explain.
Yeah. It's also not the only time in this reading where I raised my eyebrow at potential anti-Semitism. So
I agree with you. There. I don't know, dude. I think that I've read a little bit of stuff around his essay on the Jewish question, which people often bring up as his anti-Semitism. He's an atheist, is basically what he's saying. You know, he's saying that the social liberation of the Jew is their liberation from Judaism. Their liberation as a person is their liberation from the religion. And I don't think, I mean, if you're talking about being anti-religion as also anti-Semitic, as in I don't care for Judaism, the religion, in the sense of any religion, then sure, I guess, but not really.
Yeah, I haven't read that, but that's fair. I think I would very easily say the same thing about Christians.
Yeah.
So
yeah, right? Exactly. Like, your liberation as a Christian is your liberation from Christianity.
Yeah, because Christianity is inherently an oppressive system, just like all organized religion is.
There you go. So, yeah, I'm pretty quick to hand wave that kind of argument.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know if there's other big stuff you want to hit in this chapter. There are a couple of points that I think are relevant if we're going through summarizing what's happening here.
You know, this is where Marx talks about where does the surplus value come from. The popular opinion is that it comes from exchange, right? And Marx argues against that because exchange necessitates inequality, right? I don't really have that much to say about it.
Okay.
There's a lot of little things. I mean, that's the thing is Marx does a lot of clarification that you just kind of have to hold in your mind, and then it might come up later, you know? He keeps mentioning the fact that, say, the values of all the commodities go up or all the commodities go down. It doesn't really matter as long as the ratio of the values stay
relative,
the same.
Yeah,
he keeps bringing up that kind of point, and it's not necessarily important to what he's saying immediately, but he said it enough times now that I'm keeping it in mind.
Yeah.
That happens a lot here.
Well, yeah, I was just going to lay it out this way. He says on 134 why exchange occurs first. The material differences among commodities constitute the material motivation for exchange. These differences make the commodity owners dependent on each other. Neither has in his hands an object that satisfies one of his own wants or needs, while both have in their hands an object that satisfies one of the other person's wants or needs. So this tells us where is the motive to exchange coming from. And then a few pages further on 139, he tells us how value increases in exchange with an increase in labor. But the owner's labor isn't represented in the commodity's value, and a surplus beyond that value as a price of $10 that is at the same time a price of $11, or in other words, in a value that is greater than itself. The commodity owner's labor can create values, but not self-valorizing values. His labor can enlarge a commodity's value. Adding new labor, he can supplement existing value with new value, for example, making boots from leather. The same material now has more value because it contains a greater quantity of labor.
Yes.
So again, back to the point of him establishing surplus value as part of that exchange circuit. He tells us why we exchange things, and now he's telling us, well, the more labor that you see in a commodity, the higher value it's going to have. And I think that this is him very clearly laying the formation for the argument that he's putting together that he'll get to around where that surplus value really comes from.
Yeah.
But another component of that, I guess, is on 141.
Okay.
There's a social relation that's occurring here as well between the capitalist and the laborer. The owner of the labor power and the money owner encounter each other in the market and enter into a relation as commodity owners of the same standing, different only in that one buys and the other sells. Mm-hmm. They are equals before the law. In order to maintain this relation, the owner of the labor power must sell his commodity for a limited time only.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so what he's saying here, we kind of skipped this on page 140, is that, say the capitalist is surveying all the commodities he can sell, and his goal is to make surplus value. Just buying and selling a commodity wouldn't necessarily do it. Just MCM, engaging in that process of circulation, doesn't necessarily do it.
Yeah.
He has to find the commodity that is capable of generating more value.
Yes.
Right? And if we're talking about value being sourced from labor, then the commodity he has to buy is labor power.
Yes.
Right? That's the commodity that the capitalist can buy, which ensures that his money will become valorized, will become more money. And so on 141, he is selling his labor power for a limited time, right? If he sold it all at once, he'd be selling himself as a slave. He even says that, like, there are conditions that are required before labor becomes a commodity in the market. Primarily, society has to be advanced to the point where there are people whose only option is to sell their labor, right? He says that they can't sell their commodity instead. A second essential condition needs to be met. The labor power's owner can't sell commodities in which his labor has been objectified. He has to sell as a commodity his labor power itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so that does necessitate a certain level of advancement, right? We can't have people creating their own commodities. The only commodity they have in order to sell is their labor. So once all those things have happened, we are now looking at a ready-made labor market as a division of the commodity market. We're kind of skipping through a lot of this abstraction here. Yeah. Marx is saying, boom, the labor market's there alongside the commodity market. Now the capitalist can buy the labor as the commodity of interest, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, the next few pages are all just about how the amount of labor power encapsulated in a commodity dictate the value of that commodity.
Yeah. He talks a little bit about the means of subsistence. The wage that is paid to the laborer is ultimately the cost of the means of subsistence. So still in the same way, we're talking about the value, I guess, of the commodities that are then used by the commodity that generates value. So, you know, we're talking about the means of subsistence as a part of the cost of labor.
Yeah, that even, I mean, you can take that same attitude toward, think of it in an industrialized way. If you have a machine that generates, you know, makes bedpans or something, I don't know, whatever the fuck, it makes bedpans, there is a cost of maintenance for that machine in order to generate those commodities.
Sure.
Capitalists see their workers in the exact same way. There's a cost of maintenance of the worker, meaning you have to pay them a wage that maintains their existence and ability to show up.
Yeah, I wonder if he'll mention minimum wage here, but I just remember in Wage, Labor, and Capital, the minimum wage is this societal standard, the least that I can pay for the subsistence of this worker. Yeah. And he even says in here that that means of subsistence is culturally defined. You know, different cultures have different means. There's different rates of things that happen in different cultures. So just to step out of the abstract for a second, I mean, there are differences in what the means of subsistence are. We're not talking about like each person requires 3 crackers and 4 gallons of water and 5 pounds of sugar. It's like, no, we're not doing that. We're just saying there are means of subsistence that are factored into the cost of labor as a commodity on the labor market. But all of that happened in the bit that Marx skipped. So, an interesting thing on 146 and 147 is that unlike any other commodity, we loan our labor to the capitalist, right? The labor is paid after. You know, we give them our labor for a time being. We give up the use value of our labor to the capitalist in this sense, but they pay us after the fact. And there is something about that cycle. The worker always lets the capitalist buy on credit. This extending of credit is no mere illusion, which we can see not only when wages bought on credit are lost due to the occasional bankruptcy on part of the capitalist, but also from a series of even longer lasting consequences. And I just really, really love the footnote 52. There's 2 kinds of bakers, full price and undersellers. Nearly all the undersellers sell bread that has been adulterated with alum, soap, pearl ash, chalk, Derbyshire stone, dust, and other similarly pleasant, nourishing, and wholesome ingredients. So, you know, the thing is that he says, it is a matter of necessity to take from their baker or from their chandler's shop whatever bread is offered to them. That cycle of payment, where we're saying you only get paid every 2 weeks or every week or every month, that is to the advantage of the capitalist. And it's not that credit that the worker gives to the capitalist is illusory, right? It is serious. It's just interesting. I mean, I don't think anyone thinks of it as like, I'm loaning you my labor, you will pay me in 2 weeks. But totally true. Yeah.
Your labor is offered in advance for the promise of payment. It's a loan.
Yeah, exactly.
I would like to call out just one philosophy thing. At the end of the chapter, he calls out Jeremy Bentham.
I'm so glad, because I had no clue what he was saying there.
Okay, well, I will fully admit I do not have a doctorate in philosophy. I don't have my PhD, but Jeremy Bentham is an important philosopher to me. Jeremy Bentham is a well-known utilitarian philosopher, and he is also one of the most often cited philosophers in the context of animal liberation and vegan philosophy. But what I think is interesting here is that Marx is being pretty derogatory toward Bentham, definitely very pejorative in his language, and I feel that he is equating hedonism and utilitarianism in a way that makes me uncomfortable. So the quote here, Bentham, because each cares only about himself, the only force that brings the two parties together and into a relation with each other is self-concern, private interests, personal gain. And precisely because each person thus thinks only about himself and no one else, and also as the result of the pre-established harmonious order of things, or perhaps under the auspices of an infinitely shrewd providence, their work advances nothing but mutual benefits, the common good and collective interests. So hedonism is a form of utilitarianism where, I guess, let me just back up for a second. Utilitarianism as a philosophy just means deriving the most good for the most people possible, if I were going to simplify it as much as possible.
Sure.
So you make a decision based on what creates the most positive outcome. The most good for the largest number of people. The trolley problem is a very common example that's used in philosophy and memes nowadays, and it derives from a utilitarian philosophy originally.
Sure.
And so the idea is if you've got 5 people tied to a train track and 1 person tied to a train track, and your evil baron is there at the switch, and you have time only to do one thing, you can't save all of them. Whom do you save?
Right.
A utilitarian would say, let it run over the 1 person and save the 5. The outcome creates the most positive result. Okay?
Yes.
That's a simplified version of utilitarianism.
I'm just laughing at, I have an answer for the trolley problem that nobody likes, but it's my answer. Well, my answer, which got me in trouble with my philosophy teacher when we did this in high school, was obviously you let the 5 people die. Because if you pull a switch and someone gets hit by a train, you're a train murderer. But if 5 people get hit by a train and die, then it's just a freak train accident.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So actually, Peter Singer is a very famous utilitarian that kind of has an attitude toward that.
Okay.
We don't need to get into it right now.
Sorry. Sorry.
Well, hedonism is a school of utilitarianism where it is purely self-interest. So you're looking for the most good to satisfy yourself, okay? So it is a form of utilitarianism, but it does not encapsulate utilitarianism.
Sure.
Utilitarian philosophy and hedonist philosophy are not the same. And it seems to me that he's intimating that Bentham was a hedonist, not a utilitarian, and that bothers me. I am not the most well-read philosophy student in the world by any means, so if any of our listeners happen to know why Marx is making this argument, let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Well, I have something that I can posit here, right? And it's, again, the difference in the spheres. Marx is talking about a particular equality in the circulation sphere, right? In this means of commodity circulation or even money circulation, there is an equality or an equivalent exchange, you know? But he's saying that, you know, it's like, oh, here's all our equality. Great. The system is perfect. To say that equality is within the system as a whole is to only look at the sphere of circulation. Because in the next paragraph, he says, something changes when you leave the sphere of circulation or exchange, right? This is what I was talking about earlier.
Okay.
The former money owner now strides ahead as the capitalist, while the owner of labor follows behind him as the worker. There's a shift. It's no longer equal because we're no longer in the sphere of circulation. I think that's really all I mean, he might be derisive towards Bentham here. I couldn't tell you. It's clear that Marx feels a certain way about systems of equality in which people act in self-interest. But he's saying that kind of equality is completely shattered once you step into the sphere of production. At the end, one grinning self-importantly, eager to do business, the other wary and reluctant to continue, like someone who has brought his own hide to the market and can't expect anything other than the tannery. You know, so I think he's laughing about equality when it comes to circulation because he knows that as soon as you leave the sphere of circulation, which circulation is not the only part of our reality, that equality is gone.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's what he's doing here, and I don't know how he feels about Bentham as a whole, but
I don't either. It is something that I marked as a question to investigate because I mostly like Jeremy Bentham.
Sure. I mean, hey, I gotcha. But here we go. We've now stepped into the sphere of production.
Yes.
Chapter 5.
The labor process and the valorization process.
Yeah.
So I think he kind of starts by giving a definition of labor, but in pretty typical fashion for Marx here, he develops that definition through the chapter, and I don't think we get a full definition until probably closer to like 159.
Okay.
It opens with a very simple definition. Labor is nothing but the use of labor power.
Yes. Labor power specifically involving human beings.
I don't know if you want to get into this in this episode. But this is a majority of my notes are around speciesism.
When you texted me and you were like, there's a lot in chapter 5 about, about animals, I was like, oh no.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to usurp this conversation and turn it into something else, but I certainly have a lot of comments about that. And when we inevitably do talk about this, I think I'm going to come back to this text a little bit.
All right, maybe for now then, let's just do a quick summary. What he's saying is that it's human labor because the human plans in their mind ahead of time. Later, he talks about Ben Franklin saying that human beings are tool-making animals. I know there's real physical examples that maybe defy both of those, but this is just to say what Marx is saying, right? That's his argument for why human labor is different than instinctual animal labor.
So yeah, he moves from the definition, labor is nothing but the use of labor power, to then say, like you said, it requires a plan. It requires that the structure to be created is created in one's head ahead of time. So there's like a plan necessitated there. And that the worker realizes a goal in doing so, a conscious goal that functions as a law determining both the work he performs and how he performs it, and to which, moreover, he must subordinate his will. He must orient his will toward the purpose of his labor. Now, this definitely does have a lot to do with my take on do animals labor, but it opens a pretty big door to the forms of labor that are not commodity production. I think that there are forms of labor that we would qualify as labor, human labor, that are not commodity production. And maybe this is going to go back to what you said at the start of the show about you don't need to only think of commodities as a physical thing that gets produced at the end. But that was my note. What about the service industry? What about salespeople? What about repair work? These are things that are not necessarily creating a new commodity. They're not producing a new commodity. But I think we would all very clearly delineate them as labor.
Well, I think that this might be a better place to return to when we hit chapter 6. When he's talking about the transference of previous value into new value. I think that there's something to be said about this question there, because I'm thinking specifically about repair. Your labor is still creating value in the sense of
it's functioning now.
Yeah, even if you're not producing a commodity, you're still instilling that previous commodity with value. You're transforming it into, the repairer is making it a repaired commodity now. So you're taking the previous value of the commodity and adding something new, whatever you use to repair it, including your labor. That value is then in the repaired product. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and he kind of develops that a little bit further when he does literally talk about maintenance of machines, but he kind of intimates later that there is a history of labor involved before the repair person makes their way to a thing. Yeah. And so you are simply reigniting the value of that initial labor by being a repair person, rather than like creating some new value wholesale per se.
Yeah, you're really transferring value from repair objects onto a commodity that already had value instilled in it from its original labor process.
Yeah, let's say an amplifier, a guitar amplifier, for example, is functioning, and it functions because of all of the components and labor that was put into it initially. But if it no longer functions, it loses value. It's no longer as valuable as it once was. Yeah. You now hire a repair person to come in and restore the value that it previously had.
Doesn't he say when something loses its use value, it ceases to be a commodity? So...
He does say that, but I think that my pushback against that was that there are still raw materials in that thing, so it doesn't lose all of its use value. A machine is still scrap. Yeah. If a machine no longer does what the machine is supposed to do, you can still sell the scrap iron. You can still get all of the component pieces, and there is value there. It's just not the same value as its component pieces all put together.
Maybe we need to circle back in chapter 6, because I think even when he says if the use value is lost, the commodity also, it no longer is a commodity, I think the very next line he kind of pushes back on that.
I have a note wherever he does say that, so maybe we can come back to that.
Well, I just know that there's so much stuff in chapter 5 to come.
But I think the points that he laid out there are relevant. He's developing that definition of labor again. So it's more than the application of labor power because it requires some forethought. It requires these other things that he's setting up here.
Yeah. It's not just the movement of your limbs, but also that actual planning. Like, I like that he says the end result already exists when the process begins. That was really the thing. And I know that there's like, I'm just doing it by the seat of my pants. Like, that's not the point, right? It's just the idea that you are imagining an end result and then you are putting a process into action to then realize that result. Whereas perhaps an animal is just acting instinctually.
I have a lot to push back on that.
I completely understand. I completely understand.
But yeah, he goes on for a few pages there. I guess I would jump ahead to 159 where I think he finally lands on a full definition of labor. Because he now says, presented in this way, labor is an activity whose purpose is to create new use values, the appropriation of natural materials to satisfy human wants and needs, and what universally allows the human metabolizing of nature to take place. That is way more abstracted than his original definition, but I think it encapsulates all of these other things that he's brought forth in the last few pages. That it's not just the movement of one's limbs, but it's the movement of one's limbs with the purpose of creating something of use value that uses raw natural materials to satisfy a need and allows that process to continue.
Yeah, I even like on 158, when he's talking about goods that are semi-manufactured.
Oh, yeah.
To think about that is nice because really every commodity is not an end goal, but a midpoint. You know what I mean? Like, that commodity is then put into use in the production of other commodities, if not the satisfaction. Like, if they're not consumed immediately for the satisfaction of their wants and needs, then they are put into another chain, essentially. So, I don't know, just something nice about that there. How wheat tastes doesn't tell us who grew it, and looking at the labor process tells us just as little about the actual conditions in which it is carried out, right? Whether it's under the slave overseer's brutal whip or the capitalist's watchful eye. You know, I thought that was nice.
Yeah.
Now, here's where we get back to our capitalist. You know, we're putting ourselves back in the mind of the capitalist here, and he's purchased all of his commodities, all of his components, all of the labor, and with a sharp and practiced eye. Now he's going to consume that. He's going to use those materials and the labor power, which are his to use because he bought them, or at least entered into a contract with the laborer to pay him later for stuff he will get now. And what is he going to do with it? Well, I love this line on 161. Having bought labor power, the capitalist can incorporate labor as a live fermenting agent into the dead components, also owned by him, that go into the product. There's something really interesting about that. The fermentation of it is really nice. Like, you're taking this old labor, in a sense, right? These commodities that are crystallized forms of old labor, and you're literally reinvigorating them. You're activating that old labor as you would activate a yeast. And with that, you ferment a new, tasty product, something delicious and carbonated. I just really appreciated that. But the capitalist doesn't make products for social progress. Although boots, for example, make social progress possible to some extent, and our capitalist is clearly a man of progress, he doesn't manufacture boots for their own sake. Use value is not the point. The point is the exchange value. And not only is he looking for exchange value, but he is looking for surplus value.
Exactly.
There's a secret in here, right? He spends a little time talking about how the value is transferred from previous commodities to the new commodity. I think that is interesting stuff. I mean, the spindle and the cotton become bound up within each other in the spinning process. They don't just lie quietly side by side. Again, just a personification of objects. What does he say?
Thingification?
Yeah, the thingification of people and the personification of things.
Yeah.
He's definitely doing some personification of things here in a very interesting way. I'm just trying to gather my thoughts here. I have a lot of shit highlighted on 163.
Yeah, same.
I mean, it's just the fact that the timeliness of it isn't necessarily important.
Well, you're talking about like the timeliness, and I think at the end of the chapter he has a quote that I think points to why he made such a stink about timeliness. So it's one of those points where he's bringing something up over and again. It's like, why does this fucking matter?
Yeah, the timeliness matters because we'll get to it.
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll get to it. I know why the timeliness matters now that you mention it. I do know. Okay, so the labor, again, we're kind of talking about abstract labor here. We're not really super concerned about the specific process. Just know that the capitalist has already bought the labor. He gives a literal numerical example in which the figures are completely arbitrary. I was like reading through all of 165, and then I got to the bottom, and I was like, oh yeah, obviously this is all made up for example, you know? Not to say that you couldn't do this. That Paul Cockshot video, he literally calculates the surplus value generated by a barista, and it was interesting. I don't want to do that ever, but it's possible.
Yeah.
Just an old British professor going, the American left is going crazy. Not like that. I'm sorry, Paul Cockshot. Hit us up, leftonrightfeedback@gmail.com. Okay, so 166. Our capitalist can't believe it. The product's value equals the value of the capital advanced. What the fuck? Why did I go through all this production process if I'm not going to make any fucking money off of it? But that's because he's only used 6 hours of the labor. Now, I just love this. I'm just going to do a lot of reading here because this is so fucking good. Our capitalist, who is well versed in vulgar political economy, will perhaps say that he has advanced money in order to make money. All of this argument to me was like some dickhead at the Georgia State School of Economics talking to me and going, well, when you think about it, that's all of these arguments. And so just keep that in mind. He will perhaps say that he has advanced money in order to make more money, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He might just as well have intended to make money without producing a thing. Footnote, from 1844 to 1847, he withdrew part of his capital and spent it speculating. Then he gambled it. The capitalists are stupid. Then he begins to sermonize. One should appreciate his abstinence. He could have frittered away his 15 shillings, but he spent them productively, using them to manufacture yarn. And he has yarn now rather than pangs of conscience. So again, he's not looking to amass wealth. The money has to be kept in circulation. That's important because that's the only way that it will valorize itself. Our capitalist might have found solace in the idea that virtue is its own reward, but instead he starts to raise his voice. The yarn is of no use to him. He made it in order to sell it. Thus, he should sell it. Or better yet, he should produce things that satisfy his own wants and needs. That's something that a previous capitalist might have suggested. Well, just produce the stuff that you need, Our capitalist becomes defiant and defensive, rearing up on his hind quarters. He asks, can a worker make commodities out of thin air simply by using his arms and legs? Didn't he supply his worker with the material the worker needed to embody his labor, and in which his labor is thus embodied? Given that penniless persons make up the vast majority of society, hasn't our capitalist rendered an immeasurable service to society by providing the means of production? This is just every fucking argument that you will ever have about where does value come from. Oh man, you couldn't make this with nothing. The capitalist does a really important job. The boss pays all the money and buys all the stuff ahead of time. You couldn't do that yourself, you fucking poverty freaking...
Yeah, it's every justification for trickle-down economics ever given.
Yeah, not to mention that a service is about use value. We're not talking about use value here. We're talking about fucking exchange value. So forget service, Mr. Capitalist. Then, our friend, who had been cocky in the way of capital, suddenly takes on his worker's modest demeanor. Hasn't he worked too? Hasn't he performed the labor of overseeing, of managing the spinner? Shouldn't his work too generate value? The capitalist's own overlooker and manager shrug at this. In the meantime, he has begun to grin broadly. His old expression is already back. His whole speech was just a ploy. Such discussions don't interest him at all. He will leave the lazy excuses and shallow arguments to the people paid to deliver them, the professors of political economy. So fucking good. Haven't I worked also?
Yeah.
I'm a laborer too. So then finally we get to the trick of it all. We still haven't answered the question, where does the surplus value come from? Let's take a closer look at this. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but half a day's labor covers the person's means of subsistence. But guess what? When you arrive at the factory, you're not just supplied for 6 hours of labor. You are, in fact, supplied for 12. So, on 169, the capitalists foresaw this case. The worker finds a factory equipped with the means of production for a 12-hour labor process, not one that lasts only 6 hours. In that time, the labor has produced more value than was originally within it.
Yep.
That's it. It's a simple trick. And it's also one that someone will tell you straight to your face. Pay someone else to do the work for you. You make the money. It's not a secret, y'all, but it is the trick of it all.
Yeah, the magic trick works at last. Every aspect of the capitalist problem has been solved and not a single law of commodity exchange has been violated.
Right. The exchange is no issue. It's still full of equality, full of Bentham, right?
Yeah.
But if you look in the production sphere, you'll notice that he has indeed made a surplus value, right? When he incorporates living labor power into their dead objecthood, he transforms value, past objectified dead labor, into capital, self-valorizing value, a live monster that begins to work as if its body were possessed by love. A little odd there, but hey.
Yeah, this is coming back to your point about the transition from the circulation sphere into the production sphere. through the exchange of value between a capitalist and a laborer, the quote-unquote equal exchange that's happening within the circulation sphere creates that surplus value for the capitalist because they've moved into the production sphere, right?
Yeah, exactly. The sphere of production is where the surplus value is created in this sense, even though it still doesn't defy a single law of equality when it comes to exchange.
Exactly.
I love on 171, right? He does talk a little bit about like wasted labor. Only the labor that goes into production is considered valuable, but it's not necessarily that all labor is, because we're still talking about socially necessary value time. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of bringing in a little bit that we skipped from before, where he talks about socially necessary labor time. But I like the quote on 171, right? Our capitalist does in fact buy labor power of normal quality in the labor market, and the labor power has to be expended with the usual degree of exertion, the socially average degree of intensity. Thus, our capitalist monitors the worker's efforts anxiously, making sure that he doesn't waste any time not working. The capitalist buys labor time for a limited amount of time, and he insists on getting what is his. So already we're starting to see the inklings of maybe class antagonism here, right? What drives the antagonism between the classes, the capitalist and the worker? Well, for one, the capitalist has to hold accountable the worker to the time that he has bought. I even love the footnote 18 where he talks a little bit about slavery, and he makes a really interesting point that's been observed before by other economists, in that slavery, all the tools bought have to be big and bulky and useless, essentially, because if you were to invest in like high quality tools, they'd be broken. It just made me think of those legacies of slavery we were talking about in the last episode. Just an interesting footnote there. Check it out. Okay, and that kind of rounds out chapter 5. How does it end here? He talks a little bit about complex labor. Again, just kind of hinting at what it means.
Yeah, that's actually the line that I highlighted about him making a stink about the timing or age of labor.
Yeah.
Labor that counts as complex labor as opposed to socially average labor results from using labor power whose training costs are higher. It takes more labor time to produce such labor power, which thus has more value than its simple counterpart. So I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, the timing of the labor is valuable here for a couple of reasons. One, the complexity of the type of labor dictates a more training or whatever that requires more time.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah, or the complexity of the thing being manufactured requires more labor, because even if you are the last one on the assembly line and it still takes you 0.2 seconds to solder the thing that you need to solder or whatever, there's a culmination of all of the people that have come before, so the timing of that labor still dictates the value of the commodity at the end.
Yeah. Kind of unrelated to that point, but the footnote 19 was really interesting to me because, I'll just read it.
Yeah.
In part, the distinction between higher and simple labor, or skilled and unskilled, rests on mere illusions. Right? At very least on the differences that long ago ceased to be real and still exist only due to tradition and convention. In part, the distinction is based on the comparatively helpless condition of certain strata of working classes, as a result of which their members can't insist on getting the value of their labor power. So just, it makes me think of this whole like skilled versus unskilled labor, all labor is skilled labor, It's like, yeah, Marx agrees here.
Yep.
We're not making a value judgment. We're not making a moral judgment, pardon me, when I say skilled or unskilled. He's just trying to acknowledge literally the labor time required in producing skilled labor. I just really appreciate there, because it really cut through all of the stupid arguments about like, is this labor skilled? Is it valuable? All of it is labor.
Yep.
All of it is labor. It felt before maybe that I was like acting reactively. If I was saying that in reaction, right? All labor is labor, right? Say that with your chest. That might seem like a silly slogan, but even here, Marx is saying the distinction is mostly illusion. But yeah, I really appreciated that footnote, because it's from the man himself, okay? You can't tell me what Marx says or doesn't say, because he says it right here.
Yep.
He says it right here. It's an illusion.
Good point. That takes us to our last chapter of the day, chapter 6, constant capital and variable capital. My big takeaway from this one was all around the valorization process.
Yeah. The parts of the chapter that I appreciated the most were what I was talking about earlier. The way that value is transferred from previous commodities. I'm just kind of trying to wrap my mind around Marx's formulation of value creation in the sense of like where the value is rooted, really. A weird way to say that, but if you're thinking about all the different steps in the creation of a product, right? You want to take in all of the labor in each step of that product. So the question of like, how is the old labor realized in the new product? And what Marx says is just that it is preserved in the labor being added to the commodity. That
Yeah.
was a really roundabout way of saying that the old value is still in the new value.
Yeah, it's
Right.
just an accumulation of value
Yeah.
through the accumulation of labor.
Nothing crazy, but to see Marx lay it out here, I think was really helpful for me.
Yeah, sure. What I took as probably the best definition for valorization that he gives in this chapter comes from a little deep into it on the bottom of 182, top of 183. The amount by which a product's total value exceeds the combined value of the elements that went into making it is the amount by which the valorized capital exceeds the value of the capital that was originally advanced. So basically, that valorization is just the excess or surplus of value that is created through the combining of all of the other elements that went into the creation of that commodity.
Yes. I was looking ahead, and there is a chapter that is literally like the calculation of surplus value,
Oh, God.
so I hope you're ready for more math. It is nice to have Marx lay out a real numerical example, even if it's arbitrary, right, just to see how the numbers interact. However, the usage of pounds, shillings, and D, whatever that is.
Yeah, I don't even know.
Dinar? I don't fucking know. Not helpful for me, okay? I would prefer it to be in dollars and cents. So maybe I'll have to find an example of my own. David Harvey doesn't give me anything in that.
Really?
He's really just talking about the main... He's like, here's the general themes and some real-world examples. And I'm like, okay, that's nice. The nicest thing about these chapters is that I felt that I understood them.
Yeah.
With chapter 3 excluded, maybe, but I was able to work through chapter 3 no problem. But like reading the companion here wasn't necessary, I felt, because I felt like I had a pretty good grasp on chapters 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, I did too. I felt pretty good about them.
Yeah.
They feel much more straightforward and a little bit more linear. Chapter 3, again, it just felt kind of like
A lot.
going in circles
Yeah.
and I didn't see what the end game was. So
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So it's lit. Maybe the hardness of those chapters has made these seem really, really easy.
perhaps, yeah.
But anyway, what else did we have in chapter 6?
Well, this is where he's talking about the means of production and the value that the means of production offer, which we kind of brought up before, and I'd like to get to again.
Okay.
On 177, he says, from this it follows that in the labor process, value is transferred from the means of production to the product only to the extent that these means lose their exchange value when they lose their independent use value. In other words, the means of production give a new product only as much value as they themselves lose when the product is made. And he continues this on 178, talking about a machine that dies. The corpses of machines, tools, and factory buildings always continue to exist independently of the products they helped make. Its use value is used up completely during this period, and thus its entire exchange value is transferred to the product it is employed to make. And that's where I was saying I have a little bit of pushback against that as an idea, because it's still made of material that can be scrapped and has some inherent use value to it.
I think that Marx is working in the abstract here.
Yeah.
Because he does talk about if you lose, say you spend 115 pounds of cotton, if you're guaranteed to lose 15 pounds of cotton, then the value from that 15 pounds goes into the 100.
It's just built in, yeah.
Right. So
he calls it devil's dust.
Devil's
too.
dust, which was very
I
funny.
was like, cocaine?
Well, it's like when you distill whiskey and you age it in a barrel. Whew, my southern came out there for a second. When you age in a barrel, part of it evaporates, and it's called the angel's share. That's what this reminded me of.
That's funny.
Yeah. Anyway, but a little further down, this holds for all the unavoidable waste that the labor process produce, at least insofar that waste can't function as a new means of production and thus also as independent use values. So, just like you're saying, that machine can still be scrapped. There are still independent use values in the body of the machine. Its original use value, though, is no
not
longer
realized. Yeah.
That's how I read that, really.
That's fair. Again, I know I'm thinking of this too concretely when he's talking about it in the abstract, but I'm thinking of like a table saw, for example, or something like that, right? It has a particular use value. I use it to cut wood that I need to make my furniture or whatever. If I'm a manufacturer and I buy 40 table saws for my factory or whatever, I'm not factoring in to the cost of the goods and materials the potential resale of the broken table saw in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever it's going to be. I'm not assuming that to be a thing. I'm saying that my thinking is that it is mistaken to not recognize that there is still value in that raw broken table saw. But I also don't expect a capitalist to incorporate that as part of their valuation of a commodity.
Well, it's interesting because he says that I don't see why not. He doesn't say that. I say that. I don't see why not, because he's, in the same way that a capitalist incorporates the maintenance of the machine, if $1,000 machine wears down over 1,000 days, then it's transferring its value at a rate of $1 per day. I don't see why they wouldn't think of the value that they could reap from the machine afterwards in the same way. Just maybe not that they're like actually planning it in advance. Like, I'm going to buy this table saw and in 10 years I'll sell it for...
Yeah. Well, the difference is the maintenance of the machine is factored into the cost because it makes the cost go up.
Yeah.
The sale of the machine when it breaks down is not factored into the cost because it would make the cost go down. Like, okay, it's going to cost me $1 a day to maintain this machine. I'll charge an extra $1 for the product. But in 10 years, I can sell it for $100. That doesn't mean I'm going to take many cents off of the cost.
Oh, yeah. You know what? I think you're right.
It only works one way.
I think you're right. And it's because they're greedy bastards. Yeah. It's because they're greedy bastards.
They're after only the accumulation of capital.
Yeah. I don't have a Marxian answer for that, but yeah, fuck them. Fuck them!
But I honestly, that's all I really got from Chapter 6.
Yeah, I think, just to give a quick definition, he does mention constant and variable capital. Literally, constant capital is the unmoving material, right? The raw material in its rawest form. Something interesting is that he says capitalists would rather speculate on the most basest materials rather than the most developed ones because the lack of labor, so to speak, in each of them allows for a greater increase in its surplus valuation, perhaps. I don't know if I really expressed that correctly, but yeah, that's kind of all I have for Chapter 6 as well.
Yeah. Well, that seems like a good place to call it on this reading.
Yeah, cheers to that. Listen, I feel pretty fucking good, man. If the rest of the book is like chapters 4, 5, and 6.
I sure hope we are on the downward slope, because these last few chapters went way more smoothly than Chapter 3 did. And I recall you saying at the start of our reading that everyone says Chapter 4 and on is where it starts to get easier. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
It's the cavalcade of quotes. I have a few.
Okay.
He's talking about producers of commodities. Our commodity owners learn then that the same division of labor that makes them into independent private producers also makes this social production process and their relations within it independent of them, the producers themselves. This is the part. They learn that their independence from one another emerges in and is complemented by a system of all-around dependence on things produced by other people. And if there is not a better definition of a libertarian, I have never read it in my life, because that is exactly what it is.
Yeah. I just love the way that Marx talks. Sometimes he'll personify a commodity in a way that just is, the commodity has already acquired a new skin, having sloughed off its original use form. Very crazy. There's a lot of ways in which he talks about the market like a monster, the commodity like a beast, the circulation process opening its maw wide to consume. I mean, it's pretty intense.
I have one just like that, in fact, on 158, 159.
Okay.
Kissed by labor's flames, these use values are appropriated by labor as its own bodies, animated by it in the labor process, so that they perform the functions, the work they were made for. They are, of course, consumed, but they are consumed with a purpose. I just love that kissed by labor's flames phrase. I thought that was so good.
Yeah, this is on page 156. Actually, it's footnote 7. It may seem paradoxical to call a fish that hasn't yet been caught a means of production in the fishing industry, but we don't yet have a technique for catching fish in waters where they don't occur.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's just, it's like, it's so funny because, like, it is corny, but it's like, your gut reaction might be like, what do you mean the uncaught fish is my means of production? And he's like, well, buddy, tell me this. Guess what? Yeah. Go catch fish in a water without fish in it, dumbass.
I have another on 145.
Yeah.
I know we're kind of jumping all over the place here. But he's talking about education. A particular kind of training or education is needed to modify the general nature of human beings in such a way that they become skillful and deft in a particular branch of labor, or in other words, become developed and specialized labor power. And that just spoke to me as a former public school teacher, because we all know that the public school system in the United States was instituted by industrialists and robber barons in order to breed factory workers. So the way that we educate people, in this country at least, is very specifically to create a special kind of worker.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that just really spoke to me there.
Yeah, I totally get that, man. I'm looking at 158 here. You don't think about the previous labor until something goes wrong. What doesn't matter for this process is that flax and spindle are products of previous labor. Just as for the purpose of eating, it doesn't matter that the bread is the product of the combined previous labors of farmers, millers, and bakers. However, when the means of production and the labor process fail, their character as previous labor is keenly felt. A knife that doesn't cut, yarn that constantly comes apart. These things make it hard not to think of cutler A and spinner B. I just think that, really true. You don't think of the labor until it's in the negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like invisible and taken for granted until you're forced to
suddenly
face
it's
it.
like, what fucking idiot did this, you know? Good stuff. I don't know, man. I really think that if the rest of the book is like this, not only will I feel good about having read Capital, but I feel that I'll have a pretty good grasp on it, too.
Well, maybe that's a good transition to the close of the show. What questions are still lingering for you? What questions are left for you after reading this set of chapters?
Well, something from our discussion, why really did we get off the gold standard? I mean, I have an answer from one book that I've read, but I don't know how true that is. The gold standard is still on my mind. I'll just say that much.
Yeah.
As always, where are these points going to lead? That's a big one.
In his argument or for you personally?
Both, but specifically for his argument. Already we've seen the ways in which he started to hint at things that I know will come up later. The main one in my mind is class antagonism.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested to see the way that Marx elaborates on that. Is it going to be as granular as the first 3 chapters? I really hope not. But, I'll take it.
Yeah, I will say that your latter point is the one that's at the fore of my mind. We have expressed this previously already, but especially digging through the slog of chapter 3, I was really fighting with, what is my goal here? Why do I want to read this? Yeah. Because it would just felt so labored, for lack of a better term. And I was...
Very nice.
I was just like, what do I stand to gain from this? And it's kept that in my mind. How is this going to change my politic? How is this going to make me a better Marxist?
Well, I think that this section has already answered some of my questions from the last one, and not answered necessarily, but they've started pointing towards the fact that an answer will be had.
Yeah.
Like my question about the market. Is it commodity exchange that's creating these issues? The answer is kind of yeah. If it's the contradictions of commodity exchange that are leading to the formation of capital in this, the question now is there a formulation of commodity exchange in which those contradictions can be controlled or perhaps reformed in a way that allows for a positive motion, China. Again, they brought back in the forces of capital with the aim to control them.
Yeah.
So already I'm starting to feel better about those questions being answered in the long run.
Yeah, that's true. It's inevitable that we're going to read a book about modern China.
We better.
Yeah.
We better. Listen, will I become a Dengist? I don't know. It's critical support for China right now. I'm still uncomfortable with capital, obviously.
Yeah.
So, we'll see.
Yeah. The other question that's still lingering for me, and one that I hope we'll address more directly soon, is... it came out in the last episode, and it was very hard to not come out this episode. What is with Marx's speciesism? And I wonder why he feels the need to make such a clear distinction about human labor. Not that I even think the labor argument is the strongest argument for veganism in communist spaces, but...
That was really what I was going to say, man. I'm sorry.
I do think it is one.
Yeah.
But I just wonder why that distinction is made. And in the limited interactions I've had with folks talking about how veganism and communism, in my mind, are necessary for one another, I've gotten pushback with people calling to Marx specifically, and I think that that's problematic, and I don't know, I just want to know why he feels the need to make the distinction, and so I hope to get more clarification on that as we continue in the book.
Me too. I'm really worried that he's just going to leave it at that. Like I've said my piece about humanity.
I think it's likely that he will, because it wasn't a common attitude to have, to recognize the personhood of non-human animals, and so I don't think it's likely that he'll return to it, but I am curious nonetheless.
I certainly am interested in a Marxist argument for animal liberation. I just am. Like I said, I've already accepted it as our cross to bear, and that's fine. I'm not saying it's an albatross or anything. I'm just saying that it's there,
Let's hope it's not an albatross.
Sorry for the animal pun. Word.
So, Will, what are we reading next time?
Well, Aaron, this time I think we're going to do something a little bit different. right? We've been at a real want for anarchist theory, and so we've put together a little bit of a primer.
Correct. In the description of this episode, you'll find a list of all of the stuff we're going to read for the next episode, including thinkers like Bookchin, Malatesta, Kropotkin, Cafiero, Bakunin, Rocker, and Lucy Parsons.
Rock and roll. You, listener, if you have any other anarchist suggestions or comments, critiques, recommendations, rationalizations,
apologetics for Jeremy Bentham.
Yeah. You can email us, leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
That's right. And don't get left unread.
See ya.
Bye.